In this video, we're going to walk through how to set up Visual Studio Code when we already have Visual Studio 2022 installed. And why am I clarifying the fact that we have Visual Studio 2022 installed? Because we have Android Bits, the SDK for Android, already pre-installed, so that's something we don't have to focus on. We also have OpenJDK installed, and we don't need to go through that installation process. What we need to do is we need to come in, scroll down, and install Visual Studio Code. We can find this also on visualstudio.microsoft.com/downloads. When we look at whichever version that we want to do, we are assuming this is a Windows install, so we would pick the Windows 64-bit installer, go through the installation process. I already have Visual Studio Code installed for other classes, for Java development with the robotics team, for creating Markdown pages for GitHub. I have all different kinds of things that I do in Visual Studio Code, so I'm just going to go ahead and open it up. If you go through the installation, just go ahead and accept the defaults as you're going through that process. Once I get into Visual Studio, you most likely are going to see the welcome screen. We always have access to shut it down and find it again underneath the help menu, where we can just click on the welcome and it's going to pop back. And why is that really important? Because sometimes when we add things, we have these getting started documents that they put in for us to use as walkthroughs, and we'll take a look at one as we go through and do our .NET MAUI. Now, if you're new to Visual Studio Code, we have menu options at the top. We'll be using this terminal menu, so when it references it in the walkthrough and gives us a link to open the terminal, let's not use that. Let's go ahead and use the toolbars, get kind of familiar with the IDE where we can find things. Within Visual Studio, we also have different icons down the side. Now, I am missing my debugging icon for whatever reason, but I should be able to get it back if I do a Control-Shift-D. And we see it now show up. We have the Explorer option. Now, when I click on that, it goes away, though. So I'll have to do that when we are going through and doing debugging, but unfortunately, it doesn't stay. I don't know what I did. I haven't had time to actually dig in to figure out why it's missing. That's for another day. We are going to look at the Explorer. This is where we are going to see all of the files. Notice that we have the ability to create, in my case, I already have Java installed. I can create a Java project. When I install C# and .NET, we should be able to see that we have the ability to create a .NET project after we do the installation for .NET MAUI and all of those C# bits. We also have the source control. In the source control Explorer, we're going to look at that next week on how we can integrate with GitHub to get our assignments and then push our assignments back up to the GitHub repository remotely. We also have the ability to do search and replace. If we need to find a specific set of text within a document or documents, so if we have a bunch of files and we want to search for hello, for instance, if we were in a big hello world project, we could put in hello and search for it. It will show us all instances of that. And if we wanted to change that hello to hi, then we would just put in hi and do a replace, and we could change all instances in all files. So kind of slick, nice little tool. The last icon that we're seeing is the extensions, and the extensions is essentially going to be where we can add functionality to Visual Studio Code. If we do not add any functionality, it's pretty slimmed down version of an IDE. It expects that we're going to add what we need to use to do any project development. If I need to do some Python, then I'm going to go through and add some of the Python bits, and I can show you what some of those might be. If I need to do some JavaScript, I can put in like a live server reference and then run through a fake server when I'm running my pages. I can do all different kinds of things, and what we want to do is we want to go through and add the C#. Now, we do not, as Windows users, need to install Visual Studio Code and do our development here. Microsoft is not necessarily going to sunset .NET MAUI in the Visual Studio 2022. The reason why they did it in Mac was because they were having a harder time keeping all of the development the same between Windows, which is their original platform, and the Mac that they started bringing on later, and it was just becoming too overwhelming. They were running into difficulties. They couldn't get the functionality delivered, and they wanted to also focus on putting things in Visual Studio Code. So they had way too many platforms that they were trying to focus on, and so they decided that they were just going to work on the Mac in the Visual Studio Code arena. So we can't use our full-blown IDE for Mac development. We can use Visual Studio Code on the Mac side. We can use either option on the Windows side. Go figure, that's where they've typically spent a lot of time with their products, is on the Windows platform. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the extensions. It's going to show me the full list of extensions, and you can see here that they have some recommended. I do Docker stuff, so they have decided that I might be recommended to install some Docker things, which I don't really like, so I leave those out. I have debugger for Java, so lots of Java with Gradle. That's going to be things that I use for Java development with the robotics team. I have IntelliPHP, so I have PHP stuff. The Jupyter stuff is used with Python development, as well as you'll see some Python things. I have Live Server. I have Markdown stuff for those GitHub READMEs, more PHP and Python and Pylance. So lots of different things that you can install. None of these came pre-installed. I installed every one of them. Now for our .NET MAUI, I'm going to search for .NET MAUI, and it's going to bring me up the options that I could potentially install. We are going to take the .NET MAUI, and I'm going to go ahead and install that by just clicking on that install button. Notice that it has dependencies. If I read through the documentation here, which I really don't usually do, I can see that there's dependencies. I have a dependency on C#, I have a dependency on the C# dev kit. Each of these has a dependency on the .NET install tool. So when it goes through and installs the .NET MAUI, it's going to also bring in all of the dependencies that this particular extension relies upon. Now, once I have finished with my installation, and it usually doesn't take much time, I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and we should see in my list of installed that I have my C# instances that I've just installed, the .NET MAUI, C# dev kit, and then the .NET install tool, all the things that it indicated were necessary. Now that I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Usually we just leave this open, and this is our working area of the screen. I'm going to go ahead now and go back to the help and into the welcome. Now, we see that we have a new getting started with C# dev kit that was not there before. If I hit the more, you may not need to hit the more depending on how many things you have installed. You may see the .NET MAUI right here, but I'm not seeing it, so I'm going to hit the more. If I hit the more, it's going to give me the complete list of walkthroughs. And I want to start with the getting started with .NET MAUI, so I'm going to go ahead and click there. And it's going to go through and give me a checklist of things that we can do. And I've done this just with Visual Studio, not with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code together. I've gone through and uninstalled a bunch of stuff so that I can get it back to a state for this. That's why it was pre-checked. Now it gives you a list. Now with the .NET MAUI development on Visual Studio Code, it requires you to be signed into a Microsoft account. If you do not have a Microsoft account, you're going to have to go to Microsoft and create an account. I'm going to go ahead and connect. It already sees that I have a connection there, but I'm just going to go ahead and connect, and it's going to bring up a little dialog at the bottom of my screen. You can see it right here. I can go ahead and close it, and I'm pretty much complete. So once you log into Microsoft, it's going to be complete and it's going to be happy. So then we need to look at setting up our .NET environment. Now this is where they're going to start giving us commands that we need to check. And we're going to check those using our terminal. So we're going to open our terminal window. It's going to show up at the bottom. I'm going to come down just a little bit here. Let's click on this again to bring it back up. Okay, I seem to have gotten it back now. Let's go ahead and do that check. Type in .NET -- version down below in the terminal window, and it's going to return which version of the .NET SDK is actually installed. If for some reason it's returning nothing, you need to do a search for .NET 8 SDK and download that and install it. Because we've already installed Visual Studio 2022, it automatically installed 8. 8 is the current released version. 9 is currently in pre-release. We want to make sure that we have the released version and not the pre-release. Let's go ahead and click on the Set Up Your .NET MAUI. And it's showing us that the command that we want to take a look at is the .NET workload list. We need to go through and do that. So type down below .NET workload list. We should see some of these things actually coming in. It's telling us that if we have Visual Studio installed, we would see the Windows, the MAUI Windows, the Mac Catalyst, the iOS, and Android, and Aspire. We need to still go ahead and install MAUI. So let's go ahead and do a .NET workload install MAUI. This is going to allow it to bring in all of the templates. We have to say yes, we want it to allow it to make some changes, and it's going to start downloading a bunch of MSIs to do installations for. This will take just a few minutes to complete. Now that that's done, we should be able to do a .NET workload list. See that now we have MAUI in addition to MAUI Windows. Now we're ready to proceed to creating our first .NET MAUI app. If I click here, it's going to give us a link to go through the creation process, but if we go back to our Explorer, we should now see that we have a create a .NET project. So if we click on that, after a minute or so, it's going to bring up a list of applications. We want to find .NET MAUI app. We want to save it to a location. I've already created a folder previously for this. This is RVC, MAUI. Go ahead and select that folder. It's going to come back and ask me what name I want for my MAUI app. In most cases, for your assignments, you're going to be provided with a name if a starter file isn't already provided. In this case, we're going to go ahead and just leave it as the default MAUI app 1. Go ahead and hit enter. Then it's going to tell us to create the project. Let's go ahead and click on that. And it should go through the gyrations to create the project. We'll see that it's popping in a Solution Explorer. We'll look at that in a little bit. It's going through, it's taking a look at all of the requirements to make sure that everything is in sync. If it has any issues with anything as far as the Android configuration, it's going to pop up. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do, and we didn't have any issues there, is I'm going to check some of my paths and then re-evaluate my integration because I've been doing a whole bunch of stuff with putting things in and out. One of the things that I can do is I can come over into Visual Studio, and if I continue without code, I can go into my tools and go into options, and I can take a look. If I go down to the Xamarin, this is kind of old school. Any of the integration with Android and iOS used to be considered a Xamarin integration. They've renamed it to .NET MAUI, but we have all of our paths that we use for our SDK for our Android where it actually installed it. So I'm going to copy this. We should also note that we have our JDK where it put that as well in case we need to fix up those locations in our IDE. So over in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to do a Control-Shift-P, and it should bring up this window. And I want to go through and I want to configure my Android, and I want to set my SDK path, and I'm just going to paste in this location to make sure that it's pointing to the correct location. When I do that, it's going to go through the analyze step again. As long as everything is okay, then we should be all set to try to run and debug. I'm going to go ahead and do my Control-Shift-D. Since I don't see my run and debug, you'll probably have this, so you can just click there and then you should see this run and debug. Since mine only pops up when I do that key combination, I'm going to go ahead and click on it. It's going to ask me what, C# and .NET MAUI. Now if I had a XAML file open and tried to do it from that point, it would know exactly what to launch, but because I don't have my XAML file open, it's going to then just go ahead and ask me what I want to do. Now we'll take a look in a minute at our Solution Explorer once we get this to run. The very first thing it should be doing is popping open our desktop version on our Windows computer, because we haven't assigned any other target other than our desktop. So here is our desktop application. We can see what it looks like here. I can go ahead and click the button. Notice how many ever times that I click on that button, it's going to update the text on the button. So that is the demo application that when you create a new starter project, it starts with that code. Now, if I go to my File Explorer, we can see in our Solution Explorer, this is all of the files that are in that solution. It has one project, which is the MAUI app project in the solution. There is a hierarchy here where we could have multiple projects within a solution. And we have these XAML files, and these represent our user interface. They have code behind files that contain C# code, but the XAML is essentially going to give us the user interface. So we can see an image, we see labels, we see a button. Those were things that we saw on the actual application. If we launch debug from within here, it's going to understand that this is a XAML project for C# that it needs to run. The next thing we want to do is we want to try our Android emulation. So at this point, we want to go ahead and run our Android device. We choose our Android device using Control-Shift-P. We can then pick our Android device. We have our Pixel 5. That's going to set it. Let's go through and start debugging. It's not done yet. It's starting the debugger. You can see that it's starting up at this point. And at this point, we should be able to go ahead and click the button and see that it's reacting similar to what we experienced with our desktop solution. So this is the walkthrough of installing Visual Studio Code, getting it to run with a .NET MAUI application using the emulators, the same as pretty much what we were able to accomplish in Visual Studio 2022. And we use some of those dependencies that were installed as part of Visual Studio 2022.